Hi everybody. This module we will be looking at grammar. Now, proper grammar when we write is really important for a couple reasons. Uh, First of all, it allows the paper to flow. Obviously, um, clarity, making sure that you have proper grammar makes your writing more clear and understandable. And it also gives you that credibility that you know basic rules of grammar. If we look at papers that are written that have poor grammar, one might think to themselves, well, why should I trust their argument for a particular thesis if I can't even trust them to know how to use a comma or a period properly? So grammar is an important part to the persuasive process of writing papers. And so we're going to dedicate this module to uh, proper grammar and mechanics and just common mistakes that people tend to make when writing. So some of the things that we're going to look over is just kind of words that we typically confuse, particularly within philosophy, verb tenses, commas, active versus passive voice, different sentence types, run-on sentences, and then a sentence fragments. Some commonly confused words that we typically see, not just in philosophy, but writing in general, are known as homophones, words that sound the same but are spelled different and have different meanings. One particular that I see often mistaken is affect and effect. These are two words that mean different things, and so it's very important to get uh, the spelling correct. When we use affect with an A, we're using it typically as a verb, an action word. So we might use it in a sentence such as, the decision will affect the final outcome. So here uh, we have the subject doing something, um, affecting the final outcome. Effect, on the other hand, is typically used as a noun, so we think of it as a substitution as a for person, place, or thing. Example being the effect was caused by changes in weather and patterns. Here, effect is the subject. This is the thing that we're talking about. This is the thing, the verb being caused by. So we can see the differences in these two words, and it's important that we don't get them mixed up because remember, when we're writing philosophically or in general, we're doing so to help understanding. And so if we're using the wrong word, it's going to make writing less understandable and more confusing. So we want to make sure that we get these type of words correct. Uh, in addition to the mistake of affect and effect, there are also other uh, homophones such as there, and there, to, bear, bear, right? These are all words in which we spell the word different and have different meanings, and so it's important that we get those words right. Now, as it pertains to verb tense, it's also important to understand whether or not we're talking about tenses in the present, in the past, or in the future. And this is important because when we start to use certain verbs, it helps know what time frame we're talking about. Is something happened in the past and we're talking about it happening in the past? Has it started and finished in the past? Has it started in the past and is continuing on till now? Is it a future? And so it's helpful to become familiar with um, verb tenses and different instances where we have irregular verb tenses. So for instance, the word cut. Cut in present past is always the same. So cut, cut, cut. While you might have a word like sing, we wouldn't necessarily say it as singed with an ed on the end like we might normally see in past tense. Instead, sing is um, trans is used as sang or then sung when used with the helping words have or has or had. Again, it's important to get these types of phrasings correctly, because if we begin talking in the present but then switch over to the past, it may make it difficult for the reader to know whether or not an action is current or has been finished in the past, really what we're talking about. So the more exact we can be, the more consistent we can be with our tenses, the more accurate and understandable our writing is going to come across. Now, when we use commas, these are probably the most misused punctuation mark. And part of the reason why I think it goes back to how we're taught about commas in grade school. I often remember being taught that when you come across a comma, it's the same as taking a breath, right? So you want to kind of pause, take a breath in, and then finish the sentence. And to me, this always meant that anytime I want to take a pause, I am going to put a comma in that place. But this isn't what commas are for. While we take a pause for commas, we don't put commas for pauses. We use commas for 4 reasons. We use them when we are dealing with independent clauses and dependent clauses. We use them within items in a series. We use them for introductory words and coordinate adjectives. So these are the 4 times that we use a comma. We don't just place them anytime we think we want to take a pause. So here are some examples of those different types of comma usages. The independent clause versus, or separating out independent clauses, for instance, the instructor put us in small groups and she gave us new assignments. Here we have 2 completed sentences, right? So we have 2 independent clauses, what comes before the and what comes after the and. And we're separating those 2 independent clauses with a comma. Now, if we got rid of the and, we could use a semicolon in its place, but with the conjunction and, we want to place a comma between each independent clause and before the and. We also might remember from grade school that we put commas in when we use items in a series. So anytime we start listing things off, we'll put commas between things. The students exchanged their essays, read them, and gave each other suggestions. And it's important to note that in the writing style that we're going to be talking about, the comma will come before the and as well. I know sometimes we read that you would have a comma and then between the and you would not have a comma, because sometimes the comma is read like a conjunction. So you might think to read it, the students exchanged their essays and read them and gave each other suggestions. And so having the comma and the and together would be redundant, read them and gave each other suggestions. But this isn't the case, right? This is essentially separating items. So even though the and is there, we need to make sure that we're separating them. If we didn't have the comma between read them and the and, we might think that there are only 2 items within this series, exchanged their essays being one, and read them and gave each other suggestions as another. So we can lump those 2 together, which is why it's important to place that comma before the and, so that we know that there are in fact 3 items here and not just 2. We also use commas in front of introductory words when we use adverbs, particularly. Actually, comma, the class was more interesting than it would be. So here we are placing a comma to separate out the kind of meat of the sentence with that adverb, with that kind of introduction word that gives the meaning or relates to the previous sentence. And then lastly, between coordinate adjectives. So again, when we list more than one adjective, we don't want to say the long boring lecture is finally over. The long boring lecture is finally over. So between every adjective, we will put a comma. We don't want multiple adjectives running together without commas between them. So this is when we use commas, and it's important that we continually refer back to this common usage idea so that we make sure to use them properly, not just put them anytime we think there's going to be a pause. Now, another important aspect to writing, especially when it comes to persuasiveness, is active versus passive voice. When we use an active voice, we are being more authoritative. We're being more forward. Passive voice makes the writing sound meek. It makes it sound unsure. And so if we think to someone who is being confident and direct versus someone who is meek and passive, the active person, the confident person is going to be much more persuasive. So active voice is when the subject does the verb. We can see an example of this at the bottom. The cat scratched the door. The subject of the cat scratched the door. So we're talking about the subject doing an action. Passive tense, passive voice is when the verb or the action happens to the subject. Here, the door was scratched by the cat. So here we have the subject at the end of the sentence. And again, it doesn't come across as being as confident. It doesn't come across as being as persuasive. We want to continually be in that active voice. We want to make sure that we're writing in a way where our subject does the verb rather than the verb or action happening to the subject. And by doing this, it will radically transform how we write. Now, looking at different sentence types will help us when it comes to punctuation. It'll help us when it comes to understanding fragments, compound sentences, where to place commas, and so forth. Simple sentences are those types of sentences that just include a subject and a verb, one independent clause. So this is just a simple sentence like, the cat scratched the couch. Here, we're just talking about one subject, one verb, and explaining it in this just kind of complete sentence independent clause. Now, you also have a compound sentence, which consists of two or more independent clauses. So we looked at that, an example of that a little earlier. These clauses can be joined by a comma or a coordinating conjunction. Any kind of word that will connect two parts of the sentence. So words like and, but, for, nor, or, so, or, yet. These are just a few examples of ways in which we can create compound sentences. Again, two or more independent clauses together. Now, in addition to compound sentences, if you have a sentence that has one independent clause and one dependent clause, then it is a complex sentence. In a complex sentence, one part of the sentence is dependent on another, which means that one half of the sentence has a subject and a verb, while the other half of the sentence has just a subject or just a verb. So is dependent on the other half. A compound complex sentence has two independent clauses and one dependent clause. So we're just kind of combining aspects of simple sentences, compound sentences, and complex sentences to create compound complex sentences. So here are examples of each simple sentence. Amy enjoys reading. Here, Amy, the subject, enjoys reading. A compound sentence, so two sentences that are combined with a conjunction. Amy enjoys reading, which could be a complete sentence on its own, and she can read very quickly. Again, a sentence that is an independent clause that could be a sentence on its own, connected with that comma and the word and. Complex sentences, remember, an independent clause with a dependent clause. Though Devin has a demanding job, he really enjoys it. So the first half is not an independent clause. Though Devin has a demanding job, it's not really explaining any type of action based on that subject. So we need the second half of that sentence to let us know what the action is going to be, what the verb is. And then lastly, compound complex sentence. She is selling her old house, which is only 1 bedroom, and she plans to buy a bigger house. So here we have the complex sentence. She is selling her house, which has only 1 bedroom. There is an independent clause and a dependent clause in that order. And then comma, and then another independent clause. She plans to buy a bigger house. So again, remembering these type of sentence types allows us to better map out how we're going to write our sentences. We need to make sure that these elements are within a sentence and that we know prior to writing the sentence, are we writing a simple sentence? Are we writing a compound sentence, a complex sentence, or a compound complex sentence? Don't just write and let it come out as it is in your head. It doesn't always make sense on paper. So we need to be very meticulous about every little thing that we do. Just like when you watch a movie, there's costume designs for extras, right? So the woman who's in the red dress in the background, there's a very specific reason why that dress is red. Same thing when it comes to writing. We want to make sure that we know exactly why we're doing everything. There's a reason for why we're adding a complex sentence at this point. There's a reason for why we're creating a compound complex sentence at this point. And having those reasons will make our writing better, more persuasive, and give us more credibility as we're writing our papers. Next is run-on sentences. I see these often. Essentially, run-on sentences are those sentences when we join 2 complete statements into a single sentence without the proper punctuation. So if we were to have a compound sentence but no comma, we would have a run-on sentence. So an example, the movie ended, I went home. Here we would need a comma between the movie ended and I went home because these are 2 independent clauses. We can't just have no punctuation as if it were a simple sentence, because it is not a simple sentence. It is a compound sentence. So we need that proper punctuation. Without it, it doesn't really make sense. Typically, we want 1 sentence, 1 idea kind of thing. And here we have 2 ideas within 1 sentence. So it's just kind of running on. Here are ways in which we can kind of correct that. If we have a run-on sentence, we can separate 2 independent clauses with a period and capitalize the next word. So if we go back briefly, we can look at that sentence where we have no punctuation and then just put a period instead, and then capitalize the first letter of the next sentence. Another way that we can do it is separate the 2 independent clauses with a comma and then add a coordinating conjunction. Those words again, and, but, for, nor, or, so, or yet are examples. We can change one of the independent clauses into a dependent clause with a subordinating conjunction. So again, create out of this a complex sentence. Or we can separate the 2 independent clauses with a semicolon if we have maybe 2 sentences that are both talking about the same thing. You want to be 1 sentence completely, and we might just separate them with a semicolon rather than a comma and a coordinating conjunction, or rather than putting a period and then simply just capitalizing the first letter of the next word. And then lastly, just sentence fragments. You might see this from time to time on papers. Teachers writing fragment in the margin or on the side of the paper. Essentially, a fragment is just an incomplete sentence. It is one in which the punctuation is not used properly or does not possess the subject and verb that will allow the sentence to make any sense. So here, as an example, he works at the garage and the bank. The problem with this sentence is the second sentence has no verb in it. So we don't know and the bank what. We don't know what's happening. We don't really have that subject. We don't have that verb. It's not going to be a sentence that can stand on its own. So we need to make sure here that we are using a comma instead of the period. So he works at the garage, comma, and the bank. So we're separating out the independent clause from the dependent clause and the bank. We can do it that way, or we can just put a period and then add some additional words. He works at the garage, period. He also works at the bank. Here we see that there are two independent clauses, and they can be separated into two individual sentences. So these are just some examples of grammatical corrections. There are so many to go over. I recommend that you look back through other types of grammatical errors, subject verb agreement, making sure that you have the correct verb tense with the subject tense, making sure that you know properly how to use exclamation points, making sure you know when to use italics or underlining. These are all things that have specific meanings and are used for specific times. We can't just use them willy-nilly whenever we feel like it. So make sure that you're familiarizing yourself with those, and the better we can get at this, the better we can be at writing. We can be clear, we can be more understandable, and it's more persuasive because we have that credibility and we're using language to our advantage.